So again, as long as the spanking is reasonable and causes no bodily injury. When there's an injury, sometimes even the slightest injury or laceration, if it goes to court, if there's an injury, it's usually considered abuse. Okay, and so that's, if anything, that's the one that kind of equates to what's reasonable or not reasonable. If it's causing injury, that doesn't seem reasonable to most people. Okay. Spanking with the hand or object when used as a means of discipline is not considered child abuse under California law. Again, unless it becomes unreasonable or excessive. Okay, and there's some parents that have belts and whatnot, and again, if they go into a court and the child has all these different lacerations from a belt and bruising and swelling, it's going to be considered abusive. Okay, it's going to be hard to say how reasonable that was as a consequence for whatever it is the child did. Okay. Am I going too fast? Because sometimes okay. All right. Actually, this is the same slide as the other. I forgot to take this out from last time. Okay, what do we mean by emotional abuse? We talked about physical abuse, and oftentimes people tend to immediately identify that with abuse, but oftentimes don't consider emotional abuse of a child. Inflicting of mental or emotional suffering. Okay, and I listed some items that could potentially psychologically impact the child. Rejecting that child, isolating the child. There's parents that have done that. They've put a child in a closet for X amount of time because they didn't do what they were told. Okay, that's really not considered a reasonable, appropriate punishment, isolating them. Particularly if they're locked in somewhere. That's just not a good idea. Terrorizing the child, okay, scaring them, terrorizing them, belittling, degrading, putting them down, screaming at the child, threatening, okay, and I've definitely seen that with parents. Sexual abuse definitely is tied to emotional abuse. And so even though there's these different separate categories of abuse, I want you to know they don't always occur in isolation, okay? That even with physical abuse, it has the emotional component. Mm-hmm. How is the child interpreting this? That I was at fault, I did this, and so it really impacts the child. So I want you to know, even though we're covering them in these categories, they kind of overlap each other, right? Sexual abuse, definitely there's going to be emotional abuse, problems there. Oftentimes very long-term problems that the person has to seek therapy for. Constant family discord, so if there's a lot of dysfunction in the family and problems, that does impact the child emotionally. Domestic violence definitely is up there as one of those stressors that could lead to emotional abuse and other types. It's tied to other types of abuse as well. What are some indicators of emotional abuse? Okay, and again, I know it's a lot to remember right now, so whatever you remember now is fine, but later on I want you to know you can go back and review it and look at it. Indicators of emotional abuse: withdrawn, depressed, or apathetic. Okay, particularly when you had a child who was outgoing, kind of gregarious nature, right? Didn't appear depressed, kind of a happy child, and now they're withdrawn, depressed. There's a real change in that child's behavior. Clingy and forms indiscriminate attachments, and oftentimes we find that across the board as a behavioral indicator for many types of abuse. Is they're very clingy, or they're just kind of latching on to anybody, kind of thing. Acting out. Okay, so maybe they didn't have any issues at school or at the babysitter and whatnot, but now they're having some aggressive impulses and acting out, maybe with other children or with the teacher, where they didn't have that as an issue before. Other areas you may not think of, some sleep problems. Okay, and that could be sleeping more or sleeping less. Okay, it's just changes in sleep patterns. Speech problems. Okay, sometimes stuttering we see. Eating problems. Okay, again, not wanting to eat or overindulging, eating too much. Has repetitive rhythmic movements, so you might see, rocking a lot or that kind of thing. Picking. I've definitely seen that, not just with kids, but adults too. But they're doing this a lot, that kind of thing. And suffers from enuresis or encopresis. So this is bedwetting. And this is feces when they basically don't go to the bathroom appropriately. So we see that as a problem. As a matter of fact, oftentimes when social workers just see either one of these two, it's a big red flag. Particularly if you have, an 8, 9, 10-year-old who's bedwetting and that kind of thing. So they will definitely want to take a look at that and take a look at what's going on in the family. Okay. But again, these are all we tend to sort of look at them together as clusters. Oftentimes just one of these doesn't indicate that, oh, okay, the mother abused this kid because the kid's now, picking at their scabs. That doesn't mean that absolutely is the case, okay? But it's information. Again, you're investigating and it's information. Okay, all right, so we talked about physical abuse, okay, emotional abuse. Sexual abuse is another huge category of abuse, and what does that entail? Sexual assault or sexual exploitation of a minor. Child is involved in any sexual activity with an adult or another child who is older or more powerful. So what this would include, and not limited to, but includes sex acts with children. Okay, that's kind of a given. Child molestation, masturbation in the presence of a child or children. Activities relating to pornography depicting minors. And prostitution. There's actually been parents that, prostitute their, maybe 12-year-old daughters or whatnot, because maybe they need the money or for other reasons, whatever it might be. There's been cases where parents are watching pornography and they have the kid there, watching it. So that definitely would constitute as sexual abuse. And again, is there an emotional component? Yeah, there is an emotional component for that child. Okay. Okay, some indicators. There's physical indicators, which oftentimes via a doctor or someone who's actually going to be checking this, they'll find evidence of this, but anal or vaginal injury or trauma. So there's actually some physical evidence that the child was abused sexually. Sexually transmitted diseases, that's what STDs are. That wouldn't be normal for a child to have a sexually transmitted disease. So that's a major red flag right there, if that's found out. History of unexplained injuries, diseases that, I wrote that twice, that may be unexplained. What I mean by that are diseases typically like for the reproductive area that wouldn't, again, be normal, and they kind of have this history of that wouldn't be normal for a child to have. So that would be a potential red flag. And pregnancy, okay, for a minor. Which pregnancy, I just want to say, by itself isn't considered abusive. There's a lot of nuances with that in the law, because sometimes you'll have a minor that basically has sex with another minor, that two children, but even 9 through 11-year-old girls can get pregnant. So, so it doesn't necessarily constitute abuse. Okay, but definitely it's a red flag here. Behavioral indicators. Very sexualized behavior, okay, in a manner that wouldn't be consistent with what you would expect from a child. Compulsive indiscreet masturbation, okay. And this, I know when we did the last training, I had a couple questions about that, because you do see very young children, even preschool children, that basically will rub up against things, that it doesn't mean necessarily that there's something wrong with that. So they might rub their genitals like up against a table or wherever, a bed. It's actually very normal human behavior to do that. It feels good for them, and so they do that. This is actually going to be more compulsive. It's going to be more frequent and indiscreet, so it might be in front of people, and particularly if it's an older child, okay, there would be some issues with that. So again, kind of looking at all of this together. We already mentioned enuresis and encopresis. That definitely is another potential behavioral indicator that's correlated with sexual abuse as well. Okay. So I think as long as you just remember that, it's sort of correlated with abuse in general. Overeating, undereating, we talked about that with eating problems. Excessively fearful. Okay, so they seem, particularly if it's a child that you didn't pick up on that before, and now they seem very fearful and anxious. Inability to concentrate and some sleep disturbances, which we had mentioned that one before. So again, we kind of look at these as information. Okay. And what is meant by neglect? Because you hear this, you hear neglect cases quite often. It actually makes up the bulk of most child abuse cases. Next week we're going to be talking about prevalence. And so I'll have more of the statistics and the breakdown. It'll probably bore you to tears on that. But I just want you to know most of the cases fall under this. Okay? So I really want you to know what it is. This is the legal definition. The negligent treatment or maltreatment of a child by a person responsible for the child's welfare under circumstances indicating harm or threatened harm to the child's health or welfare. So negligent treatment or maltreatment of a child by a person responsible. So let's take a look a bit more at that to give you an idea of what that is. So depriving a child of their basic needs. Okay, that's really what neglect kind of means in a nutshell. Food, clothing, warmth, and shelter. Medical and dental care, cleanliness, education. Even supervision is included there, because there's parents that, they'll let them run amok and then nobody's supervising them. And I remember one case where I think the baby was out in the middle of the road and a truck driver stopped and he got out. I don't know if you guys saw that on the news. He got out, had to pick up the baby, and the baby's just maybe 1.5. He's sitting with just diapers in the middle of the road. Thought, wow, that was good that he actually stopped and was able to see the child well enough, because it was kind of dark. But he stopped, and here this little child was sitting in the middle of the road. And then afterwards, the parent came running out, but he was just sitting in front of the TV and didn't realize the kid, went out the screen door and is in the road. So things like that happen, and again, it's not up to us to determine whether or not the parent would lose any rights to the child, or the child would be. We're not in that role to determine that. What we determine is whether or not, if we have knowledge of these events, if we're going to basically call in a report of suspected abuse. Suspected. Okay? But we're not the ones that actually make the determination if in fact it was a case of abuse. Okay. So just to get an idea of this. Now, oftentimes you may think, well, what does that mean exactly? What if the parent doesn't have enough money for food? And that definitely is considered, in this, when parents are charged with this. So we're talking really about parents that have at least some ability to, provide some food for their children, and they're not. Okay? Are not providing the type of treatment if they need some dental care, and they could take them and they don't. Okay. Neglect is broken down into categories. There's general neglect. And this is where there's actually no physical injury to the child. But again, on the slide just before this, there was a depriving of one of those areas, but there's no actual physical injury to the child. That's sort of a general neglect case. Now, severe, definitely as a result of being deprived of food or shelter, we're seeing something here. A consequence that there is some physical harm to the child, either severe malnutrition, medically diagnosed non-organic failure. We've had infants that have not thrived as a result of not being cared for. Okay, so that's where you kind of would draw the line there. It's pretty black and white. Yeah, so these definitely, are ones that they're going to intervene immediately.